One of the reasons why I haven't reviewed this episode before is because this episode has been talked to death by literally everyone. Mainly the fact that it's probably the least bad episode from Foster's and they can tolerate it the most. And the fact that when it comes to the other terrible episodes, like everyone knows it's Bendy or the Imposters episode, I honestly think that what they saw in this episode, the Foster residents wouldn't easily go to low up nonetheless, despite the fact that it just made the title misleading. However, since people have been requesting me to do a review of this episode, I'm gonna give my perspective of what I feel about the episode in general. If it wasn't obvious, Mac is taking his friends from Foster's to Europe since he won tickets, but for the majority of the episode, most of the characters aren't really interested in going to Europe since that they're focusing on getting themselves packed up, and the fact that this just leads to this episode extending to 22 minutes. The synopsis of this episode really doesn't have much to offer, and believe me, the ending of this episode is honestly what makes this entire episode one of the worst, but I'm gonna get to that when I get to that. All I can say is that for the majority of this 22-minute episode, it feels like they're trying to show that the imaginary friends, well minus Frankie, aren't very interested to go into Europe since that they don't understand what Europe is like. In the beginning of the episode, Blue does mislead information about Europe and he doesn't do a perfect French accent. And when you completely see him doing a poor accent, it's really obvious that him along with the other imaginary friends aren't interested in going to Europe. And this is one of those episodes where Blue is at his worst. I mean, it's not as bad as the other episode appearances that I've seen, but when we get to Erotush, you'll probably understand where I'm coming from. But you pretty much know what I'm going to say since that this episode has been talked about so many times by other reviewers. Now the thing is, I will give this episode some credit even if they never went to Europe. Granted, they didn't do that in this episode, but for how the characters act on how they're not excited to go to Europe and the fact that they're just not really prepared to go to a different place they haven't went before, I'm completely fine with that. It's just that the ending honestly makes the entire episode meaningless and way more unbelievable to think that the other characters actually want to go to Europe, but for the majority of the episode, they don't have the adrenaline while Mac is just trying his best to have everyone be prepared for the flight to Europe. I mean, in the screenshot that I'm showing you right now, we get a gag of Eduardo taking many things, but unfortunately, he can't be able to fit in the plane because those other passengers, so Mac told him to bring him one stuffed animal, and he ends up bringing one stuffed animal, but then he was wearing a coat that was covering multiple stuffed animals, and he can't make up his mind, which is something I usually do when I go to different places where I can't make up my mind on what I want to bring with me. If you're wondering why I say that Frankie was actually one of the only characters who are actually interested into going to Europe besides the other characters, well minus Mac, well, since that she's the one who actually knows how to drive and the fact that she can be able to handle everything, and she is actually more focused on just trying to get to Europe, just like Mac, I can say for a fact that at the end of the episode where she has a conversation with Mac, she's literally the only character who is actually 100% sane. I mean, the other characters aren't sane, but at the same time, they're not insane, which there's a difference. Sure, it's obvious that she was like the other characters while she wasn't interested in going to Europe and she has other things going on, but at the end of the episode, just minutes before the infamous you-know-what, she found a taxi driver and had everything under control when it comes to the packaging and stuff. And I guess that this entire scene between Mac and Frankie is just basically shipping fuel if you ask me, but at the same time, I don't ship whatsoever in this show. But as for everything else, even the good parts doesn't overweight the negatives, and I am going to talk about the negatives. In this episode, only possibly we get Trish, who is so interested in going to Europe. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of tickets for Mac to give her, and she has a crush on Mac. Some people say that she's annoying, but in all honesty, I didn't find her that terrible. I mean, the only issue I have with her is that this is literally the only episode that she appeals, maybe, and the fact that she doesn't contribute anything other than just to add filler in this. And to be a bit fair, she gets mistreated so much by Blue, all because she had 2 tickets only to be taken away, and then at the end of the episode, while Coco laid more tickets from her eggs, or popping eggs, or whatever you call them, Blue just instantly whipped them apart. For literally nothing. I mean, if he's only doing this for the sake of not adding so many people in the plane, it's one thing, and I can understand it's wasting more time, but you really ruin Elish's chance to return to Europe. Besides, taking one imaginary friend is really not that difficult, and this actually leads to pretty much a loophole that this episode could have been resolved, but I'm gonna get to that later. As for the other characters in this episode, there's really nothing to address. Mr. Hellman, despite going to Europe, has plans once he gets there. He wants to make a schedule on doing so many fancy things at Europe, which I can understand where he's coming from, but considering that this takes up for the majority of this episode, it does literally nothing except that we won't be able to see Europe in this episode whatsoever. Seriously, they're making the Rugrats I Go to Paris movie way more entertaining, and it makes us wish that this episode was an actual movie where the characters actually go to Europe. But for Mac, on the other hand, he is easily the mistreated and most miserable person in this show when it comes to episodes like this. With him managed to completely get tickets to go to Europe, and the fact that the other characters are just not being fully aware at the fact that Mac is so interested and so excited to go to Europe, and he's willing to take them along with him, then I honestly think that they should be thanking Mac, or for the very least, be more respectful of all the things of what Mac is trying to do. With the amount of times that this episode just hammers in comedy and doesn't follow the plot, it really makes me believe that everything in this episode is just trying to have Mac go mentally insane, despite the fact that he's just doing everything the right way, while the other characters are doing the opposite. Seriously. I know I kept saying that so many times, but I can't help it, script or unscripted. But my point is that every time I think about this episode, from watching it from beginning to end, there's really nothing to discuss other than it's an episode that's been talked about constantly, except that this episode gets overshadowed by really terrible episodes. If you have a title that is about the characters going to a different location, and the fact that it doesn't end up happening at the end of the episode, it really makes the majority of this episode feel really meaningless. I mean, in other episodes, they're really meaningless, but they're an awful kind of terrible that we have a lot to discuss about it. But in this episode, there's really nothing. So whether I completely see that the characters are just not doing anything and are not invested to go to Europe, then why should I be discussing what I feel about this episode? And since I have delayed the inevitable for way too long, I need to talk about Madame Foster in this episode. Through the majority of this episode, Madame Foster isn't really interested into going to Europe, and she's feeling comfortable at home so that she can throw tea parties and whatnot. And let's be real, I really think that of how she just feels like staying at home, it's basically what every other elderly wants to do. But then again, there are so many elderlies that go on vacation in order to get away from all the stress. And considering that Madame Foster isn't in stress in this episode, which explains everything of how he's acting, pretty much makes me forgive her on the fact that she refuses to come. However, the ending of this episode, just before Mac leaves with all of his friends, she gives Mac a hug, which lasts almost 20 seconds or less or more. And then when Mac leaves to go to the airport, he's about to take out the tickets, but unfortunately, he doesn't have them. As it turns out, she actually stole Mac's 7 tickets, with all of his elderly friends coming along in ear-trust to go to Europe. The reason why I'm not really upset with this is because I honestly think that the ending was mostly a teaser joke on completely having the characters going to Europe, but unfortunately it just didn't end up happening. But I do understand why people just cannot stand Madame Foster and the derailment that she caused to herself. For me personally, there are other episodes that, well, she is at her worst, but in this, it's unforgivable. And considering that there's no continuation after this episode when it comes to the aftermath, well, besides the credits scene, I can really tell that Madame Foster would have been a lot more respectful if she can just go with them if Blue didn't rip off the tickets that Coco laid. Seriously. If you ever think about it, if Blue never whipped those tickets, then Madame Foster would have come and this would have been resolved, even with or without her elderly friends. However, I will never condone the scene where Mac's friends completely scold him for forgetting about the tickets. For the majority of this episode, you had to go to the bathroom 3 times, and the fact that you had other things to do, and yet you still blame Mac after everything. You know, sometimes when people do this type of stuff, they honestly act like hypocrites than being actual imaginary friends to Mac. So why am I supposed to see something of how they're not really invested into going to Europe for the majority of this episode, but then at the end, they're so depressed that they can't go since that Mac forgot about the tickets. You can't actually expect me to believe that Mac deserves all of this, even though that for the majority of this episode, he had to take care of everything. He just basically turned into Frankie when it comes to doing all the chores around the house, except the difference is, he's taking care of everyone who is about to go to Europe with the tickets that he has. And the fact that they are never aware that Madame Foster was the one who stole the tickets, it really makes the majority of this episode really painful to watch when it comes to the ending, but for the majority of it, a huge waste of time. If you were never going to have the characters go to Europe, then you should change the title that is actually really leading, but you can easily understand that they wouldn't go to Europe in the first place. Bottom line, this episode is just bad. The reason why I never reviewed this episode before is because there are so many other episodes that are worse than this, and looking at this episode even now, I'm not really enraged with it like everyone else was. I mean, with episodes like Imposters and everyone knows it's Benny, it's mean-spirited, goes way over the edge. And even though that this episode has some mean-spirited moments, they're not overused. So which is why I didn't find this episode as bad as everyone else thinks. If you guys expect me to review terrible episodes from the show, don't expect me to wage out completely. But then again, the following episodes I'm going to be reviewing for the next 2 months or so, I'm probably going to be at my wage moments, if I do my wage moments, that is. But hey, at least I finally reviewed this episode after all this time. I give this episode a 4 out of 10.
Let's get this started again. Me and my whole crew.